Title: The walls started whispering my name. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The story begins that he never believed walls could remember people. He believed in stress, exhaustion, old buildings settling at night. Until the walls learned his name. Until they whispered it with familiarity, like something that had known him long before he arrived. This is not a ghost story. This is what happens when a place decides you belong to it. Subscribe because some stories don't let you leave. The house stood at the end of a narrow street where the lamps flickered inconsistently and the air felt heavier than it should have. It was an old structure, built decades before modern wiring, before insulation standards, before anyone cared about the psychology of space. The paint had faded into a sickly gray, peeling in long vertical strips that made the exterior resemble exposed skin. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass slightly warped, bending reflections in subtle, unsettling ways. It was not abandoned, but it looked like it wanted to be. The man moved into the house because it was cheap. That was the reason he gave himself, the reason he gave others, and the reason he accepted without resistance. The truth was more complex. He was running out of options. His previous apartment had become unbearable, not because of anything supernatural, but because of the slow erosion of his life. Debt, isolation, long nights without sleep, and a constant sense that something inside him was wearing thin. The house promised quiet. The house promised space. The house promised nothing else. The first night passed without incident. He slept deeply, the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion rather than peace. The house made its usual noises, the harmless sounds of age, wood contracting, pipes adjusting, the occasional creak from shifting beams. None of it stood out. None of it lingered in his mind when he woke the next morning. During the day, the house felt ordinary. Sunlight entered through the windows at awkward angles, illuminating dust that hung motionless in the air. The walls were covered in layers of old paint, each coat sealing decades of unseen history beneath it. The floors dipped slightly in certain areas, worn by countless footsteps from people who had lived and left without ceremony. There were no personal artifacts left behind. No photographs. No furniture. No evidence of the lives that had once occupied the space. It felt intentionally emptied. By the third night, the quiet became noticeable. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that pressed inward, forcing awareness of every breath and movement. The man found himself waking intermittently, unsure why. There were no dreams he could remember, only the sensation of being observed by something without eyes. He attributed it to anxiety, to adjusting to a new environment. He had read enough to know that unfamiliar spaces often caused restless sleep. The whispering began subtly. At first, it was indistinguishable from the normal sounds of the house. A faint suggestion of movement inside the walls, like air shifting through narrow passages. He noticed it only because it seemed to follow him from room to room. When he stood in the kitchen, the sound seemed to originate from behind the cabinets. When he sat in the living room, it pressed faintly from the wall behind the couch. It was not loud. It was not clear. It was simply present. He ignored it. The human mind is skilled at dismissing discomfort when acknowledging it would require action. He told himself it was rodents, or the wind, or the old construction settling unevenly. He told himself the house was learning its new occupant, adjusting to weight and movement. He did not consider the possibility that something else was learning him. Over the next week, the sensation intensified. The whispering gained rhythm, rising and falling with no apparent pattern. It never occurred when other sounds were present. It waited for silence. It waited for him to be still. When the television was on, it vanished. When water ran through the pipes, it retreated. But when the house settled into quiet, it returned, persistent and patient. He began sleeping with lights on. Sleep deprivation altered his perception of time. Days blurred together. Meals were skipped. His work suffered. He spent more time in the house than he should have, canceling plans, avoiding phone calls, choosing isolation without fully understanding why. The walls felt closer at night, their surfaces subtly uneven, as if they had shifted while he was away. The first time the wall spoke his name, he did not react immediately. It happened late, during one of his restless half-waking states. The house was silent. No traffic outside. No electrical hum. Just stillness. The sound came from behind the bedroom wall, faint but unmistakably structured. Not random noise. Not imagined cadence. It was his name, elongated slightly, spoken as if tested for familiarity. He lay frozen, heart accelerating as his mind searched for rational explanations. Auditory hallucination. Stress-induced perception. memory fragments misfiring. He told himself this firmly, repeatedly. He did not turn toward the wall. He did not move. He waited for the sound to repeat. It did. The whisper carried no emotion. It was neither threatening nor comforting. It was observational, like something noting a detail for later use. His name emerged from the wall with unnatural clarity, followed by a pause that felt deliberate. Then silence. He did not sleep again that night. In the morning he inspected the walls. He pressed his ear against the paint, listening for movement. He knocked gently, feeling the hollow response beneath. He searched for vents, pipes, anything that could carry sound. The house offered nothing. It appeared structurally sound if aged. No hidden spaces. No openings. No explanation. The whispering escalated over the following nights. It began to occur when he was fully awake. Sitting at the table. Standing in the hallway. Brushing his teeth. The walls learned timing. They waited for moments when his attention was unguarded, when his thoughts drifted. His name emerged more frequently, always from a different location, as if the house were testing proximity. He stopped inviting people over. The idea of someone else hearing the whispering terrified him more than the whispering itself. He feared confirmation. He feared ridicule. He feared being forced to acknowledge that what he was experiencing was real. Isolation became a form of control, a way to preserve uncertainty. The house responded. The whispering grew closer. It no longer felt confined to the walls behind him. It surrounded him, pressing from multiple directions at once. His name layered over itself, fragmented and overlapping, as if repeated by many mouths speaking at slightly different intervals. The sound was still quiet, but it carried weight. It filled space. He began to notice changes in the walls themselves. Hairline cracks appeared where none had been before. They spread slowly, branching like veins beneath the paint. In certain light, the walls appeared to pulse subtly, expanding and contracting in rhythm with something he could not see. When he touched them, they felt warmer than expected. The house smelled different at night. Not decay, not mold, but something organic, something reminiscent of breath and skin. The air felt damp, thick, with an unseen presence that lingered long after he left a room. He considered leaving. The thought surfaced repeatedly, always followed by a wave of exhaustion so intense it felt paralyzing. The idea of packing, of finding another place, of explaining his sudden departure felt overwhelming. The house seemed to sense hesitation and pressed inward, tightening its influence with quiet insistence. The whispering began to include more than his name. It started with fragments. Partial words that dissolved before forming meaning. Sounds shaped like language but stripped of clarity. The cadence suggested intent, structure, memory. He could feel the walls listening in return, absorbing his reactions, cataloging fear. He stopped sleeping entirely. In the early hours of one morning, he stood in the hallway, staring at the walls as his name emerged again, louder than before. The sound vibrated through the structure, resonating in his chest. It no longer felt like sound traveling through air. It felt internal, as if the house had found a way inside him. The realization settled slowly, heavily. The house did not want him gone. It wanted him known. The walls whispered his name not to scare him, but to claim him. To establish familiarity. To overwrite distance. The house had learned his patterns, his breathing, his moments of weakness. It had waited patiently, growing closer with each night he stayed. And somewhere beneath the layers of paint and plaster, something inside the walls had begun to remember what it was like to be alive. By the time the second month began, the man no longer measured his life in days. Time had lost its structure, dissolving into cycles of exhaustion and alertness that followed no natural rhythm. The house dictated when he rested and when he remained awake. The walls had learned his schedule and adjusted themselves accordingly, intensifying their presence during moments of vulnerability and withdrawing just enough to preserve doubt. The whispering no longer announced itself as something external. It arrived seamlessly, threading itself through his thoughts with invasive familiarity. His name no longer startled him. It unsettled him in a deeper way, eroding the boundary between perception and acceptance. The sound no longer felt like something he heard. It felt like something the house allowed him to notice. He attempted to reclaim control by changing his routine. He rearranged furniture, altered lighting, slept in different rooms. The house responded by shifting the source of the whispering effortlessly. No matter where he positioned himself, the walls found him. They adjusted angles. They recalibrated distance. The sound always originated just behind the surface, never fully emerging, never retreating. The man began to document his experiences. He filled notebooks with dates, times, and observations, convinced that evidence would anchor him to reality. He described the whispering, the changes in temperature, the sensation of pressure behind the walls. He noted the cracks spreading like living networks, forming shapes that suggested intention rather than structural decay. The act of writing provided temporary relief, a sense of order imposed on chaos. The notebooks did not remain where he left them. He would place them on the kitchen table and find them later in the living room. He would leave them closed and return to discover pages creased, as if pressed against something uneven. Ink smudged where no moisture should have been. He told himself he was forgetting his own actions, that sleep deprivation was fracturing his memory. He stopped trusting his recollections. The house grew warmer. At first, the change was subtle, noticeable only at night. The air became thick, clinging to his skin. The walls radiated heat unevenly, warmer in some areas, cool in others, like living tissue with inconsistent circulation. When he leaned against them, he felt faint vibrations beneath the surface, slow and irregular, like something shifting its weight. He stopped touching the walls. Avoidance became instinctive. He moved through the house carefully, keeping distance as though proximity alone could trigger something irreversible. The whispering responded by growing more intimate. His name no longer echoed from distant sections of the house. It came from directly behind him, from the wall nearest his back, from the space he had just occupied. Sleep deprivation distorted his senses. He began to experience moments of dissociation, where the house felt unreal, like a constructed environment rather than a physical place. The walls appeared slightly curved, bending inward at the edges of his vision. Corners seemed less defined. Depth perception faltered. He questioned whether the house had always been shaped this way or whether it was changing around him. The smell intensified. It permeated the air constantly now, no longer confined to nighttime. It reminded him of enclosed spaces where living things had been trapped too long. Not decay but stagnation. Breath without escape. The house smelled occupied, not by furniture or belongings, but by something that produced heat and moisture and pressure. The whispering evolved. His name fragmented into syllables, stretched and rearranged. Sometimes it arrived distorted, spoken with uneven pacing, as if the house were experimenting with how to form it correctly. At other times, it sounded precise, almost careful. The repetition wore down his resistance. The sound became familiar, expected, anticipated. He began responding internally. He did not speak aloud, but his thoughts shifted in response to the whispering, forming replies before he realized what he was doing. The house seemed to recognize this change immediately. The whispers grew quieter, closer, as if acknowledging progress. The space between sound and thought narrowed. The cracks in the walls widened. Paint peeled back in long, curling strips, exposing layers beneath that did not resemble standard construction materials. Beneath the plaster, the surface appeared uneven, textured in organic patterns that resisted clear interpretation. The man avoided examining them closely. Something in his mind warned him that clarity would be dangerous. The house rearranged itself. Hallways felt longer at night, stretching beyond their daytime dimensions. Rooms seemed slightly misaligned, doors opening to spaces that felt unfamiliar despite their familiarity. He walked from the bedroom to the kitchen and arrived somewhere that felt subtly wrong, as though the house had introduced minor errors that accumulated over time. He tried to leave. The decision came abruptly, fueled by a rare moment of clarity. He gathered essential belongings and moved toward the front door with deliberate focus. The whispering intensified, overlapping his name with urgent cadence. The walls vibrated faintly, the sound resonating through his chest. The door did not open. The lock functioned normally, but the door resisted movement, heavy beyond reasonable explanation. He applied more force, his muscles straining against the immovable barrier. The house pressed inward, the walls drawing closer, the air thickening until breathing required effort. He retreated. The house relaxed. The door opened easily when he tested it later, as though mocking his attempt. The whispering subsided, returning to its familiar, patient rhythm. The message was clear without words. Leaving was permitted only when the house allowed it. After that night, the man stopped resisting. Acceptance arrived gradually, disguised as adaptation. He moved carefully through the house, avoiding sudden changes. He listened without reacting. He allowed the whispering to exist without challenging it. The house rewarded compliance with stability. The walls stopped shifting. The air grew less oppressive. The whispers began to include images. Not visual hallucinations, but impressions embedded in sound. When his name was spoken, it carried weight, context, fragments of sensation that did not belong to him. He felt memories that were not his own pressing against his awareness. Tight spaces, darkness, pressure from all sides. Stillness interrupted by brief, violent motion. The house was remembering. The realization settled heavily. The walls were not merely reacting. They were recalling something long buried. His presence had triggered a process, awakening remnants embedded within the structure. The house had absorbed something once living, something confined, something denied release. The man became thinner. Appetite vanished. He ate out of obligation, not hunger. His body weakened, mirroring the way his sense of self eroded. The house filled the void he left behind, occupying mental space with relentless consistency. The whispering replaced internal monologue, guiding his thoughts into narrow channels. He stopped checking the time. Clocks no longer functioned reliably within the house. Digital displays flickered, resetting without explanation. Mechanical clocks slowed or stopped entirely. Time became subjective, measured only by cycles of whispering intensity and brief intervals of silence. The walls grew closer, not physically but perceptually. The space between surfaces felt compressed, the house tightening around him with subtle insistence. Rooms felt crowded despite their emptiness. The ceiling seemed lower. The floor pressed upward, reducing vertical space until movement felt constrained. He began sleeping against the walls. The change happened without conscious decision. He found comfort in proximity, drawn to the warmth and vibration beneath the surface. The whispering softened when he rested there, becoming almost gentle. His name was spoken slowly, deliberately, as though soothing something restless. The house responded. The walls adjusted, forming shallow indentations where he leaned, accommodating his shape with unsettling precision. The surface softened slightly, yielding under pressure before returning to firmness. The sensation should have repulsed him. Instead, it felt natural, expected. The boundaries dissolved further. He lost track of where his thoughts ended and the whispering began. The house no longer needed to speak his name aloud. It communicated through sensation, pressure, and internal suggestion. The sound persisted, but it felt secondary to something deeper, more pervasive. The notebooks disappeared entirely. He searched for them briefly, then stopped. Documentation felt unnecessary. The house already knew everything. Writing felt redundant, an attempt to preserve a version of himself that was no longer relevant. The man's reflection changed. Mirrors showed subtle distortions, his features slightly blurred at the edges, as though the house were claiming visual ownership. His eyes appeared sunken, his skin pallid, marked by faint impressions that resembled fingerprints pressed too firmly. The whispering became constant. There were no longer pauses. Silence ceased to exist. His name echoed endlessly, layered with something else now, a presence that pressed against him from all directions. The house no longer observed. It engaged. It integrated. The man no longer wondered if the house was alive. He understood that it was unfinished, and it was using him to remember how to be whole. The transformation was not sudden. It was methodical, deliberate, and patient. The house did not rush the final stage. It had waited decades for the conditions to be right, and now that it had found what it needed, it proceeded with careful precision. The man no longer marked time, but the process unfolded across what might once have been weeks. He woke one morning unable to determine where his body ended and the wall began. The surface beneath him was warm and uneven, yielding slightly to his weight. His limbs felt heavy, slow to respond, as though resistance had increased between intention and movement. When he shifted, the wall responded, adjusting around him with subtle accommodation. There was no pain. Pain would have implied separation. This was integration. The whispering no longer used his name exclusively. It layered something else beneath it, a dense undercurrent of sensation and memory that did not translate into language. He felt impressions of confinement, of pressure sustained over long periods. He felt the slow compression of breath, the surrender of movement, the gradual fading of resistance. These sensations did not arrive as memories but as instructions, guiding his body towards stillness. He no longer attempted to leave. The concept of departure had become abstract, disconnected from impulse. The outside world felt distant, irrelevant, stripped of urgency. The house had become the only environment that mattered, the only space that acknowledged his presence fully. Everywhere else felt incomplete by comparison. The walls shifted when he moved. They no longer adjusted reactively. They anticipated. When he leaned forward, the surface met him halfway. When he rested his head, an indentation formed naturally, as if the wall remembered the shape of him. The sensation was intimate without comfort, precise without care. His body weakened further. Muscle tone diminished as movement became unnecessary. The house provided support, distributing his weight evenly, removing the need for effort. He ate rarely now, only when the sensation of emptiness intruded enough to require correction. Hunger faded quickly, replaced by a different kind of fullness that did not originate from food. The smell inside the house changed again. It became richer, heavier, layered with something unmistakably organic. The air felt saturated, thick with humidity and warmth. Breathing required minimal effort, as though the house assisted the process, regulating pressure automatically. The cracks in the walls widened into seams. Paint peeled away entirely in some areas, revealing surfaces that were no longer ambiguous. Beneath the outer layers, the walls were textured with irregular patterns that suggested growth rather than construction. The surface appeared dense yet flexible, marked with faint ridges that pulsed slowly in uneven rhythm. He avoided mirrors entirely. Reflections had become unreliable. His image no longer aligned consistently with his movements. There was delay, distortion, a sense that the house struggled to represent him accurately. He felt less need to see himself. The concept of a distinct identity felt increasingly irrelevant. Sleep arrived differently now. He did not lose consciousness. He drifted into states of reduced awareness, where sensation blurred but never vanished. The whispering continued uninterrupted, threading through his mind with quiet insistence. His name emerged less frequently, replaced by a sensation of recognition that required no verbal reinforcement. The house remembered everything. Fragments of other lives surfaced occasionally, pressing briefly against his awareness before dissolving. He sensed the presence of others who had come before him, not as individuals but as impressions absorbed into the structure. Weight, pressure, heat, stillness. The house had learned through repetition, refining its process over time. He understood then that he was not the first. The realization carried no fear. Fear required distance. He existed too close to the house now for fear to maintain structure. The knowledge settled neutrally, a fact absorbed without resistance. Movement became difficult. Not because of restraint, but because the house had reduced the need for it. The walls supported him fully, redistributing pressure, minimizing strain. His joints stiffened from lack of use. His body adapted to stillness with unsettling efficiency. The whispering shifted again. It no longer repeated patterns. It no longer tested boundaries. It flowed steadily, a constant presence that filled every gap in thought. It carried reassurance, not in tone but in consistency. The house no longer needed to persuade. The outcome was inevitable. The man's breathing slowed. The house adjusted automatically, regulating airflow through subtle changes in internal pressure. Each breath felt assisted, guided, optimized. His chest rose and fell with minimal effort, synchronized with the slow pulse beneath the walls. The concept of pain disappeared entirely. Sensory input narrowed, filtering out extremes. Temperature stabilized. Pressure equalized. The house eliminated discomfort systematically, not out of compassion but efficiency. A compliant body integrated more smoothly. His skin changed. Where it remained exposed, it grew pale and thin. Where it pressed against the walls, it softened, losing clear definition. The boundary blurred gradually, cells adapting to prolonged contact with the living surface. The house facilitated the process, providing warmth and moisture in precise amounts. The whispering stopped using sound. It communicated directly now, bypassing sensory channels entirely. He received impressions without translation, understanding without language. The house conveyed reassurance, purpose, completion. It was not malicious. It was not benevolent. It was fulfilling a function. The man no longer attempted to think independently. Thought required effort, and effort had become unnecessary. The house guided cognition gently, steering attention inward, narrowing focus. Distractions dissolved. Memories of the outside world faded, losing relevance and emotional weight. The house closed around him. Not abruptly. Gradually. The surface yielded, enveloping him with deliberate care. His limbs sank partially into the wall, supported from all sides. Resistance diminished as his body adapted to the pressure, surrendering structure piece by piece. He did not struggle. Struggle implied opposition. There was none left. The process felt correct, inevitable, long overdue. The house had waited patiently, refining its method through previous attempts. This time it would finish properly. The walls absorbed him steadily. His legs disappeared first, followed by his torso. The sensation was neither suffocating nor painful. Airflow adjusted continuously, ensuring function persisted. The house preserved what it needed, discarding what it did not. His heartbeat slowed. The house compensated, redistributing internal rhythms to maintain equilibrium. It did not require his heart to function independently anymore. The structure provided stability, replacing biological processes with architectural equivalents. The whispering returned briefly to his name. Not as a test, not as a claim, as confirmation. The house acknowledged completion of identification. He was fully known now, fully mapped, every contour accounted for. His arms vanished next. The sensation of limbs faded, replaced by distributed awareness that extended beyond any single point. He could no longer identify a center to his body. Sensation existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The house expanded subtly. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, capacity increased. The structure adjusted to accommodate its new configuration, reinforcing weak points, redistributing stress. The integration strengthened the house as a whole. Only his head remained. The house paused briefly, not out of hesitation but calibration. The final stage required precision. Cognitive functions needed careful handling to preserve what the house required. The whispering softened to a low, constant presence. His thoughts slowed further, losing individuality. Concepts blended together. Past, present, and future collapsed into a single sustained moment of existence. The house did not erase him. It repurposed him. His face pressed gently into the wall. The surface molded around his features, preserving the shape with unsettling accuracy. The wall did not harden immediately. It waited, allowing the transition to complete without resistance. Vision faded. Darkness arrived without fear, without urgency. Awareness diffused outward, spreading through the structure. He no longer perceived the house as something external. It was the environment of his existence, inseparable from him. The house finished closing. The wall sealed smoothly, leaving no visible seam. The surface returned to uniform texture, indistinguishable from the surrounding area. The paint reformed gradually, drying without cracks, preserving the illusion of emptiness. The whispering stopped entirely. Silence settled into the house, complete and stable. The structure rested, no longer searching, no longer remembering through fragments. Was whole. From the outside, the house appeared unchanged. The windows reflected dull light. The walls stood still. No movement disturbed the facade. There were no signs of occupation beyond the ordinary markers of age. Inside, the house breathed. It retained the awareness it had integrated, distributed throughout its structure. The man existed now as pattern rather than form, as sensation rather than identity. His name persisted only as internal reference, no longer requiring repetition. The house waited. It would wait as long as necessary. It always did. Eventually, someone else would notice the price, the space, the quiet. Someone else would arrive carrying exhaustion, isolation, and need. And when they did, the walls would listen. Some houses don't haunt people. They finish them. If this story stayed with you, it's because places like this don't disappear. They wait. And someone always needs somewhere cheap, quiet, and empty. Subscribe for true dark horror stories that crawl under your skin and refuse to leave. Because the walls are still listening.